Last time when we discussed bias, and we mainly discussed bias. We didn't discuss confounding. So this part 2 of the lecture, we are going to be discussing a bit of confounding. And then we'll also discuss interaction. So what is confounding? Confounding, by confounding, what do you mean by confounding? Confounding arises a situation in which a non-causal association between a given exposure and an outcome is observed as a result of the influence of a third variable, which is called a confounder. So by confounding, you tend to observe an association which does not exist. So this association, between an exposure and an outcome will be as a result of a third variable, which is a confounder. So generally, a confounder is something which try to it distorts the relationship between exposure and outcome. You then see as if there is an association. Well, there is no an association. What is a confounder? A confounder is a third factor which is related to both exposure and it is related to both the exposure and the outcome, and accounts for some or all of the observed relationship between the two. So remember, one of the critical information to say the confounder is related to both the exposure and the outcome. And this confounder accounts for all of the observed relationship. By relationship, we mean association between the two. In this case, the two is our exposure and our outcome. So that relationship might actually be accounted by a third factor, which is not actually, it's not there. It kind of distorts the true association. Therefore, you get like a false association, which is then accounted by this third variable, which is a confounder. So another important point in terms of confounding, a confounder is not a result of the exposure. And a confounder is not a result of the exposure. So we're going to discuss, this is a very common example, which is used to try to illustrate the issue of exposure, where we assess the association between child's birth rank, and birth rank is the birth order in terms of, are you the first born, second born, third born, or fifth born, and Down syndrome, which is our exposure. So in this case, you can have the mother's age as a confounder. So the association between child's birth rank and Down syndrome or outcome, you can have the mother age as a confounder. We are going to show this. You can also have another example where you have the association between the mother's age, which is our exposure, and the Down syndrome, with birth rank being a confounder. We'll show you these graphs in the coming slides, where we will really discuss this commonly used example to illustrate confounding. So, as a general rule, what is a confounder? A variable is a confounder if it is a non-risk factor for the outcome. That's number one. And a variable is a non-confounder if it's a non-risk factor for the outcome. That's number one. Number two, it is associated with the exposure. It is what? It is associated with the exposure, but not as a result of the exposure. So it's not in the causal pathway. This is very important. One, it is associated with, and it's a non-risk factor for the outcome. It is associated with the exposure, but not as a result of what? Of the exposure. That is, it is not in the causal pathway. We're going to illustrate this. And what we mean when we say it is not in the causal, in the causal pathway. Coming back to our example, which we use. So this one is trying to show the occurrence of Down syndrome by birth order. So if you look from this graph, you will see the number of if you look at the cases of Down syndrome. If you look at the cases of Down syndrome by birth order, what do you realize? You realize, one, the cases of birth order, the cases of Down syndrome, they increase, and they increase as the birth order increases. So if you look for the firstborn, and for the firstborn, the number of cases, and you're looking at the number of firstborns who develop Down syndrome. So you realize for the firstborn, the cases are fewer, but as you go, for the secondborn, for the thirdborn, for the fourthborn, for the fifthborn, the number of cases they're increasing by the number of Down syndrome cases they're increasing as the birth order are increasing. So if you go again to the next group, where we then look at these cases, and you look at these cases by age. Less than 20 years, and for mothers now, we are looking at the case of Down syndrome by age groups. For mothers who are less than 20 years, and the mothers who are less than 20 years, we have got fewer cases. But the number of Down syndrome cases, they are going to increase, and they are going to increase as the age of the mother increases. If you then combine these two now into one graph, what do you see? This one, and it is the birth order, and so you then stratify, the number of cases both by birth order and by age group. And in this case, you realize that age, and in this relationship between birth order and between birth order and between Down syndrome cases and birth order, age becomes a confounder. Why? If you then look at the number of Down syndrome cases, and which you get for less than 20, and for birth order, which is like 100, you don't have many cases. But here, what you see, as the birth order increases, and as your birth order increases, age also increases. And so it means if the mother is a child, like a first child, second child, and third child, by the time they have a fifth child, age is also increasing. And so in this case, you then look actually, birth order is actually it's like a confounder in this relationship. What actually really determines the number of and if you look by birth order, and as birth order increases, you have your also increases because of age. If you also look the other side, and it is the same, which means what actually really determines in this case, what is important in this relationship is the age. And if you then stratify by age, you realize you have more, the higher, what can I say? The older you are, the older the mother is, the more cases they are likely to have of Down syndrome, which means you have stratified. But for a young mother, the risk of then developing Down syndrome is not high. And so in this case, birth order is related to age, and is also related to our outcome, which is Down syndrome. In this case, it then becomes a confounder. So just repeating again, and this same concept, what do you call a confounder? For a variable to be a confounder, two conditions must be met. One, it must be associated with the exposure, and that's number one. It might be associated with exposure, and number two, it must also be associated with with the outcome. But its association, remember, its association with the outcome, and its association with the outcome is not as a result of the exposure. And by that, what are we trying to say? We are saying, in some scenarios, we can have the exposure causing this, and then this now causing this. That's what we call the causal, the causal pathway. And with this one, it then results in change in this, leading to this. So these are the two conditions that should be met with. One, it must be associated with the exposure without being consequence of the exposure. That's what it means. You don't get this variable as a result of this. Then number two, it must be associated with the outcome, and it must be what? Associated with the outcome, independently of the exposure, not as an intermediary result. It's not in the causal pathway. It's not happening as a result of this. So we come back again to our example where birth order is related to birth order as an exposure to maternal related to Down syndrome. So this is your birth order. Birth order, as I explained in the previous slide, maternal age is related to birth what? To birth order. And it is related to birth order. Could be higher. And if you're like a fifth born, it means the mother is older. Then maternal age is also related to what? To Down syndrome. So maternal age in this case is correlated with the birth order, and is a risk factor for it's a risk factor for, and it's a risk factor if birth order is what is low. So because of that, maternal age in this case, it meets the criteria of aging of a confounder. But if you look in this case now, and if you look in this relationship now, this is our birth order, and birth order and our exposure is maternal age. Birth order is related to maternal age, and this is, as I explained, as the mother gets older, the chance the higher the birth order, the higher the birth order, the older the mother. So because of that, these two are related. But birth order is not related to Down syndrome. And the relationship is this one. So because of this, if you change your exposure to maternal age and remove birth order, maternal age, birth order ceases, and birth order is no longer a confounder because it is not related to the two. Another commonly used example is this, and for confounder, for coffee and congenital heart disease, well smoking. Well smoking is what? Well smoking is considered a confounder. Remember, by a confounder, we are saying this relationship between coffee smoking and congenital heart disease. This one can be the possible, and it can be the possible causal pathway where coffee and where people will take coffee, they also smoke, then leading to congenital heart and smoking. Because there's so this association by what can I say? I want to try and explain it better. Could a confounder, remember, and we are closing this pathway, and we are removing this pathway between coffee, smoking, and congenital heart disease. Then this would be like the alternative, and this would be like the alternative and this explanation for this relationship, where since smoking is related to both congenital heart disease and coffee smoking. So in this case, smoking is related with coffee drinking, and is also a risk factor for those who do not drink coffee. So in this case, coffee smoking becomes a confounder. But if you reverse now, if you reverse this thing, coffee drinking is related with smoking, but coffee is not related with congenital heart disease. So in this case, if you change your exposure, coffee drinking now is not actually a confounder. So remember, it has to be related with both exposure and outcome. So if not related with the other, it ceases to be a confounder. So if you change the way your things are organized, the way you arrange your exposure, whatever variables we have, in other scenarios, that relationship changes. Actually, some of the variables ceases to be a confounder, depending on the relationships. Another common one is this, and alcohol smoking with lung cancer. We know smoking is related to both lung cancer and alcohol drinking. So remember, as I explained again, the possible explanation which can happen, it might not be this relationship where alcohol is causing G and it is causing lung cancer, but the alternative pathway now, it might be we are having lung cancer. Why? Because of alcohol, then associated with smoking, then smoking leading to G to lung cancer. So that's like the alternative pathway, which is this, but not G and it not this. Remember, we said with your confounder now can actually explain most of the relationship. And it kind of explain most of the relationship between your exposure and your outcome. So in this case, you're closing this and assume your causal pathway is happening through G, through this. So in this case, smoking is related both with alcohol consumption and is a risk factor even for those who do not drink alcohol. So because of that, smoking becomes a confounder. These are just examples, to really say some of the things, they are not like really, like for example, if you smoke a lot, you might end up having yellow fingers and because you're being bent. But yellow fingers are related to smoking. But there is no relationship between yellow fingers and congenital heart disease. So because of that, yellow fingers cannot be confounded in this relationship. You cannot explain, you cannot link from smoking yellow fever and this. Then, as I explaining now, say a confounder should be what? A confounder should not be in the causal pathway. If something is in the causal pathway, it's no longer a confounder now. Like in this case, this is a good example, and which illustrates this. Good cholesterol in this case cannot be confounder. Why? Because it is in the causal pathway. How do you explain this? Your diet, and if you know there's a relationship between, and there might be a relationship between diet and congenital heart disease, but we know the amount of cholesterol in your diet is determined by the diet which you take. So which means if you control your diet, you are going to reduce, and you are going either to reduce or increase your cholesterol. Then your cholesterol is going to increase, to increase the risk of you developing congenital heart disease. So in this way now, cholesterol is not a confounder. Why? Because it is in the causal pathway, and the diet leads into changes in cholesterol. So if it was, your diet is unhealthy, you're eating unhealthy, you're exposing yourself to fatty food because of your diet, you're going to have increased cholesterol. Then your increase in cholesterol will then lead to congenital heart disease. So this I think one of the criteria, as I said, is to say, your confounder should not be in the causal pathway, like in this case. So this is a very good example, which explains that. So just repeating again, this whole concept of confounding, we've got your exposure and your and your outcome. Then the actual process now, as I explained, to say, this is if you go here, this is the observed association between exposure and outcome. But the relationship which you are getting between your outcome and exposure, we have another pathway now, we have another pathway, which is this other pathway, which is explaining the possible, which is explaining the actual process. And remember I said, by a confounder, and we assume the relationship between exposure and outcome is going via this route as opposed to to this. So this is another example, just a repetition of what we discussed: the coffee drinking in lung cancer. Coffee drinking in lung cancer. What are possible confounders in smoking? So if you put this, is smoking a risk factor for cancer? Remember, you want to assess now. You want to make sure you meet the criteria for a variable to be called a confounder. So in this case, we say it's smoking. So we assess, is smoking related to our outcome? Yes. Is smoking related to our exposure? Yes. So in this case, smoking becomes what? It becomes a confounder. What is the actual process? The actual process is this. Is happening this via this. Another example, male gender in malaria. What is the observed association? We have got this male gender and association. What can be a possible confounder? In this case, you can have working hour and working working outdoors. And in this case, so if you combine the two, is working outdoors a risk factor for malaria? Yes. Is male gender associated with working outside? Yes. So in this case, working outdoors is a confounder. So what is happening now in here? This is the actual relation, that is the actual processes which is explaining this relationship as opposed to, and this is the male, and this is the actual process which is explaining the relationship actually between your exposure and your outcome. It's not explained by this, but it's explained by what? By the other alternative pathway through the confounder. So I know it's a complicated process for you to understand confounding here, but just remember, as I said, confounding can lead us to conclude that there is a causal relationship when in fact there is none, or there is no causal relationship when in fact there is. And so it can go both ways. Either you will not see a causal relationship, or you will see a causal relationship. So if you want to make inference regarding causation, we need to take into account the possibility of what? Of confounding, where actually we really need to, where we really need to control for what, for confounding. So usually now, if you identify our confounder, like in the example which I gave, the relationship between male gender and malaria, does this relationship persist after accounting for the potential confounder? So that's one of the most important things now. But if you identify a confounder, you then need to take necessary steps which you can then use and to try to to try to control for that, and to try to control for that for the confounding. Yeah, how do you, they are possible. There are several ways in which you can actually handle your confounding. You can handle your confounding at various stages of your design and of your stage of your research. You can control your confounding at design stage, or you can control your confounding at analysis stage. These are some of the ways which you can use to control your confounding at design stage. You can do randomization, you can do matching, you can do restriction. Then at analysis, you can do what we call stratification, where you stratify according to the confounder, or you can do what we call multivariate techniques, where you actually really put all the variables in one module as part of your analysis. So in terms of handling confounding, how do these things work? Randomization, and by randomizing, what do? You are attempting to evenly distribute the potential confounders in the strategy group. Randomizing. So by randomizing, what you are doing, you are just distributing your potential confounders, mainly they are non-confounders, randomly into your two study groups. Let's say you are comparing, and you've got an intervention group and a control group. So you have your study population. If you randomly assign them to those two arms, you're actually distributing the potential confounders into those groups. But actually, it does not guarantee the control of of confounding. Then the other way is matching. And I think we've discussed matching, where we say by matching, you what can I say? It ensures equal representation of subjects with non-confounders in study groups. We usually use matching for case control studies, and let's say you know sex as a confounder for whatever relationship you are assessing. So if you've got a male, if you've got a male case, you look for a male control, because you are matching according to gene, and you are matching according to sex, which is a confounder. But remember, if you do a matched case control study, this matching should actually be taken into consideration during analysis, where you then do what we call a matched analysis. And then another thing which you can do what we call a restriction. And for restriction, what are you doing? In most cases, and for restriction, what are you doing? You are actually restricting now. Let's say in your study, I think there's an example in the next slides, where it gives an example of smoking, and it is smoking as a confounder. You can restrict your study to non-smokers, and by restricting your studies to non-smokers, yes, it's a good way of controlling for smoking and by restricting to a specific subpopulation. But in most cases, you then lose your statistical power. You then lose your sample size as you really try to restrict to a one group. Then I think just a repetition of the same thing, your randomization, your matching. We do this at design stage, a time of analysis. You do your stratification, and then you do your stratification. Then you can do your multivariable analysis to achieve the same thing. But usually it is advisable to try and control for confounding at the time of designing the study. And so usually it's to then try and address this confounding, this whole confounding issue later. It's wiser. And during the stage where you're designing your research, during the stage where you're designing your research, you try to really address this whole issue of of confounding. So remember, I explained matching, where we use matching for cost control studies, and where we match according to the potential G, to the potential confounder. And remember, the variable which we have used to match, you cannot examine its effect now. And you cannot really, if you match according to sex, you cannot then really assess the relationship between sex and the exposure. Why? Because you have matched with that. Then there's also a danger of overmatching, and I think we've discussed this now. Whereas you try to really, as you try to do your case control studies, you might end up overmatching, where the cases actually becomes exactly to the controls, and because of that, you then lose the association. And so overmatching is something you need to be careful about when you're planning your studies, because if you overdo it now, remember your cases and controls, they should be the same, except for the outcome which you are looking for. But if you overdo it now, in some cases, they might end up being similar. You then lose the association between the outcome and exposure. So in most cases, you don't really need to match, for a lot of variables. Maybe you match for occupation, you match for age, it becomes complex. And so in most cases, people just often match for one variable, and it's easier to then manage. This is a restriction, just a repetition again. If our confounder is smoking, we can just limit our studies to those who are non-G, who are non-smokers. But those are the dangers now. And if you restrict one, you're going to decrease the power of your study. Your sample size is going to be reduced. Then by also that, we are also going to affect your external validity. And this is why? Because you have restricted to a specific population. To then generalize your findings, like in this case to smokers, it won't be valid, because you would have restricted your study to a specific group. Then, as I explained, by stratification, in this case, by stratification, I'm going to give you an example. By stratification, how do you do by stratification? By stratification, you are just stratifying now, and you're just doing your analysis or assessing your measures of association, and by strata. And these strata are the strata of your confounder. So if sex is your confounder, so you know you've got males and females. You are going to assess your relationship between exposure and outcome for females separately, for males and separately, to see if there's a difference, and if there's a difference between those. The same applies if your confounder is smoking. It means you are going to assess the relationship between your outcome and the exposure, first for non-smokers, then second for what? So first for non-smokers, then second for smokers, and those are your strata. But usually you start by calculating what we call the crude measure. This crude measure is your association between your outcome and exposure, and for the whole population. You can then separate your population down and stratify it according to the crude. You are including F1, and then you then go now where you stratify by your confounder. You look for smokers and non-smokers. So you compare now whatever measure of association you get. The crude one, you then compare it to what you then compare it to the measures of association which you get in each strata of your confounder. I will not go in detail in terms of what is multivariate techniques, but I think as you these are like it's a bit complex in terms of how really to do this. But often when you do studies, we always have a lot of exposure variables, and maybe want to look the association between our outcome and maybe among the exposures might have a lot of these things, maybe age, race, family, blah blah blah. We can actually stratification. We are just really having two layers, and if it's age, maybe you're saying those who are young and those who are old. But if you then want to include all the variables now, which are being linked to an outcome, you can only do that by what we call multivariate techniques, where you include all these variables in one model, then try to assess the relationship between your outcome and the exposure. So it's a bit complex, but I think as we do our statistics, you'll be able to understand this. Then points of caution: confounding is not an error in the study, but it reflects an underlying true association, although the association may not be causal. However, if you fail to take into account confounding, if you fail to take confounding into account in interpretation of the results of the study, you might end up having biased conclusions because you end up overestimating or underestimating the associations which you see. So it is very critical to control for confounding. This just summarizes, your sequence of events in terms of confounding. You are assessing your relationship between an exposure and an outcome. Is there an association between exposure and outcome? So the first, yes or no. If the association is there, is this a real association? Yes, it can be real, but it can be spurious actually. And what things we can actually cause us to have this spurious association? It can be due to bias or due to what to confound. So to actually really get a correct results, we need to make sure we have corrected for our bias, which we discussed in the previous lecture, and we have addressed the issue of confounding, and which are very critical. Then the next thing we need to briefly discuss, we'll not go into to discuss it briefly, with the issue of what we call interaction. And interaction now, by interaction, what do you mean? By interaction, so remember, we said by confounding, it distorts the relationship between your exposure and your outcome. But by interaction, these third variables, it modifies the relationship between a risk factor and the disease. And it modifies the relationship between a risk factor and the disease. And so in this case, for example, let's say we are looking at the incidence rates of a disease and in presence of 2G of the incidence rates of a disease in presence of two risk factors differs from the incidence and from their individual effects. So what we are saying by interaction is also called effect modification. The presence of two risk factors, actually it gives you if you check on if you look in this last slide, instead of attenuating the relationship, and what happens, These two risk factors can be additive, and which means they are now producing a strong, they are now producing a, they can actually, they are now producing a strong association. And if you add them, add 2 as opposed to 1. Or this can be additive, this can be multiplicative, this can be antagonistic, where they oppose each other, or they can be synergistic. So by interaction, what we are saying, we are not saying, we are saying this state variable is not actually a confounder, but its presence, it kind of really, what can I say? It kind of really changes or strengthens the association, and it kind of strengthen the association or multiply the association between between these two variables and what and the outcome. This is a good example, and if you look, for example, this is birth weight and leukemia and what and sex. So this is explained here, and if you assess the relationship, between birth weight and leukemia, and the crude odds ratio is like what? And it is like 1.5. So it just means, let's say, assuming birth weight, we have got low birth weight and whatever, and high birth weight is our 2 categories. And so which means for those with a lower birth weight, they are 1.5 times more likely to develop leukemia, and as opposed to those with a higher birth weight. So that is our odds ratio. So if we have got this state variable, and if we have got this state variable, what do we do? If we stratify now according to this state variable, so we have boys and girls. So if you look in this relationship, birth weight and leukemia, the association for boys is 1.8. The association for girls is 0.9. We are going to discuss this and show you a good example, and show you a good example. But in this case, you see your stratum specific, and your stratum specific for each strata, they are different, which means if you look at the girls and for boys it's almost times 2. So there's like a multiplicative effect actually in terms of the odds ratio. So in this case, sex is like an effect modifier because they are because of the difference of the odds ratio between these two. So by interaction or effect modification, what do you mean? If the strength of the association varies over different categories of a third variable, this is called effect modification. The third variable is changing the effect of the exposure. So the effect modifier may be sex, age, other environmental things, or a genetic effect. Effect modification, as I said, is the same as interactions. When you are doing statistics, we talk of the word interactions. In most cases, there is no adjustment for effect modification. Once we detect it, what do we do? We do our stratified analysis, where we then obtain stratum specific odds ratio, where we are now reporting the odds ratio which we get per every stratum, because they are different. Like in the example below for leukemia and sex. So just to round up, in terms of effect modification and confounder and confounding, often an effect modifier, it belongs to nature. It has different effects in the different strata, and it is very simple. In most cases, effect modification is useful. Why? Because it can actually be used by targeting public health intervention. If you pull this thing, or if you reduce this thing, we are going to have a synergistic or maybe an opposite effect. So we can actually apply those techniques to control some of the diseases. I don't have anything which comes to my mind which we can actually use effect modification to control. But I think if you think around, Most of these public health issues, you should be able to get one which you can change and which you can use. So it increases knowledge of the biological mechanism and it. Then what is a confounding factor? A confounding factor, it belongs to the study and it's part of the study. It's not, that's the difference between the two. This is a variable which is within your study, which is now affecting the relationship between your outcome and your gene and your exposure. As I said, we're going to discuss an example in terms of, I don't want to go into in much detail in terms of the crude odds ratio and the adjusted odds ratio. But I think I will try and give you an example where we illustrate this. It creates confusion in the data. It distorts the effect. Either you underestimate or you overestimate. And you can prevent it at two stages. Either